yesterday, James Krause, who has been a UFC staple for some time, retired. He retired, I think, on Ariel Helwani's MMA Hour, suggested he was done. And this is a guy who's got an interesting reputation, Danny, because James, like if I had to ask you off the top of your head the very best James Krause win, we should be very clear about this. He's got some good wins on his resume, to be sure, and in all the wins, he showed well-rounded, thoughtful ability, but this is not a guy who was a previous champion, for example. I don't think he ever even fought for a title. I don't think he ever got all that close, to be quite honest with you. He fought over middleweight and welterweight for the vast majority of his career. I think he had some 160 fights on the regional scene. But if I had to ask you what the significance was of James Krause retiring and why we're talking about it for a guy who, again, good record, but not a hugely accomplished record as a fighter, what stands out to you about why this news is significant?
I think it's significant because he is transitioning into a coach role, although he's been doing it for many years. And honestly, he's become a really good coach, not only in the octagon, but also I feel like on sort of the lifestyle and just outside of the octagon on how to manage your money, how to like live a proper lifestyle, making what you make inside of the UFC. Like, I feel like that's very important. And you see guys like Jeff Molina talk about it like, oh yeah, he got me to like buy a house and I didn't really know about that. Now I have it rented and I'm making a little bit of income. And I think that's super important. And so like all around, he gets the game, not only as a fighter, because he was one, obviously, and stayed in the UFC for many, many years, even though he didn't become champion, just lingering around the UFC for, 8 years or whatever the case was. That's a long time. And it requires a lot of skills. So he's got that experience, but at the same time, he's not a guy that became champion, as you said. He's not a guy that was like a huge draw. He made a decent money, but more or less was kind of like in the middle of the pack if we're talking about money. And he's, living pretty well, has a house, has a nice car. I believe he has like a Bronco, if I'm not mistaken. And like, yeah, he's been able to like invest and really sort of manage the game well. And I think he's sort of a good mentor for fighters in all aspects.
No doubt about it. Here's the thing that stands out to me, and the reason why I wanted to lead the show with it is, again, he was an accomplished fighter. He did some pretty good things. We're looking at his record. He did have, his most notable fights were ones that he, in terms of the name value of opponent, let me be clear about that, were ones that he lost. He lost to Bobby Green, and he lost to Jorge Masvidal. He does have a win over Jamie Varner, which I don't know if folks will appreciate, because that was in 2014 here 8 years later. It's crazy to be like James Krause fought Jamie Varner 8 years ago, right? I mean,
that's insane.
It doesn't feel like time has passed, but it certainly has. And of course, he finished his last fight with a win over Claudio Silva and has a win over Sergio Moraes, which is a knockout win in the third round, which is pretty good. He had some performance bonuses along the way. You get the idea. He had a good career. But I think what stands out to me is, as good of a fighter as he was, I think he's going to be a much better coach. I think he's already sort of showing himself to be, where are your best attributes? What are they put to the best kind of use? And being the guy who can train these younger fighters, people are now flocking to him. He now has a champion in his stable. Now, granted, he had a guy who was previously a champion who lost, and this was for an interim title. But the fact that, Brandon Moreno left a very good gym in Mexico, whatever his reasons may be, to go join James Krause, kind of tells you what he's putting together there in the Midwest is something of value. And I think a lot of times we look at fighters get into a coaching role. Maybe Habib is somewhat different because his whole situation is unique. And we sort of wonder about whether or not like they'll fade into obscurity, or, hey, that was a guy who used to fight. I actually feel like his profile might elevate by virtue of the performances that he's had to this point, Danny. And what you see is it seems to me, maybe I'm reading it wrong, so if I am, by all means, interject. But it seems to me that he's building momentum as a coach in a public way that I'm not sure he ever accomplished as a fighter.
Yeah, I have to agree. And look, I interview Brandon Moreno a lot, and I talked to him, and I asked him, I'm like, hey, why did you decide to leave Entran Gem? Because, dude, he became a champion with Entran Gem. He became history. Like, he became the first Mexican to win a UFC title fighting out of Mexico, which people don't really realize how difficult that is, given the resources that you find in the US, and everyone just tries to go to these major gyms. But he did it out of a small gym and put Tijuana on the map, as well as Entran Gem, who has a ton of prospect as well. That team is ridiculous. But also, like, when he lost his last fight with Entran Gem, when he lost, it was a close fight against Davidson Figueiredo. It's not like we saw him, look terrible or anything like that. But he had told me that for one fight, and I think it might have been the first Davison Figueiredo fight, James Krause had somebody fighting on that card as well, and they shared a shuttle bus that was taking them for weigh-ins or after weigh-ins. And James Krause sat next to him, and then they just happened to be talking. And then James Krause is like, he tells me he's like this fight nerd. He's just obsessing and watches every single fight. And he was, telling him how good he was and all these things that he liked about his game and maybe some of the holes that he saw and this and that. And then once Brando Moreno saw this, like, dude, this guy has me like analyzed. I barely know him. He's like, okay. And then once he started taking trips to Vegas, James Krause, for fights, they started kind of training together. And that's why Brando Moreno, as soon as he left Entran Gem, that's straight up the first place that he went to. He did not decide to try any other big gyms. He also kind of likes that personalized boxing style training camp where, everything's focused around him, rather than go to a big team and sort of be one of the many big name fighters around there.
Is there a way to explain the Entran Gem dynamic to people like us you've been there, right? You've seen it. You for folks who haven't seen it, you've done a documentary from.
That was on Lobo Gym. I haven't been to Entran.
That was Lobo Gym. That's right. We had to say Lobo Gym. Have you been to have you been to Brandon Moreno's old gym?
I haven't, but I'm dying to go. Okay, I got to make a trip to Tijuana, but they got tons of good prospects. Michael Morales, who fought at UFC 277, huge prospect from Ecuador. I mean, everybody that is training in Latin America and can't get into the US because of visa issues or whatever, they go to Mexico and they go to Entran Gym because that's literally the best gym right now outside of maybe like Shudo Box in Brazil or a few other big teams in Brazil. But excluding Brazil, Entran Gym is probably the best gym you can find in Latin America right now.
Interesting. Super crazy. Yeah, so we'll see what happens with this. There is one more note to the story, which I don't even know what to make of. It's not really related to Krause's accomplishments per se, but he had revealed to Ariel yesterday he makes the majority of his money gambling on MMA. Now, I don't know what to make of that because on the one hand, Danny, if you did this in team sports, you'd be banned for your, significant portions of the season, but it's a little bit different, right? I mean, there is a dynamic in play there about, obviously to start with, employment versus independent contractor. Obviously, the betting aspect of MMA is sort of inherent in it, but no one seems to care about an eye about it. And I'm not saying I care all that much either, if I'm being perfectly candid, but it is unusual, right? For someone to just openly and brazenly admit that they make a ton of money betting on fights when, in fact, you're part of a operation where I think that the incentive for winning is so strong, especially given the financial constraints, that no one would purposely blow a fight. Although certainly you could bet in a way that they would, but you can imagine I'll put it this way: the appearance of impropriety, right, at a bare minimum. It's a little weird for a dude right in the thick of it to be like, yes, I make all my money, or tons of money anyway, betting on MMA. Like, should we care? Is it a story? Where are we on this?
Yeah, it's funny how I'm like praising James Krause here for like being financially smart and helping fighters like invest this and that. And then like, there's also this part that he makes most of his money gambling, which is usually not like the safest route or how to invest your money properly. Let's just say that. But yeah, it is weird. I think something that kind of takes away a little bit and makes it a little bit less of a big deal is that he's not fighting. If you're fighting, I think if you're actually going in there, that's a little bit more concerning, I think, because, maybe, I'm going to, just a hypothetical situation. If you're a fighter, you could be like, if you're really good, maybe you could be like, I'm going to get this guy out in the 4th round because that's the round that, the bettors predict, the odds are the worst for me. So then, I'll coast and then I'll try to look for a finish, etc. But since he's a coach role, I think there's a little bit less of that. But still, I do get your point. I think maybe it should be a little bit of a bigger story. But at the same time, there's so many things that should be a bigger story in MMA, but they just aren't for whatever reason. Like, people just don't seem to care. But yeah, it is a little weird.